welcome to Anonymous Synthesis. I am your host, the reclusive Anonymous. Raw for short. This podcast is the beginning of an attempt to create a synthesis of information I've collected, as well as a few friends, as well as an attempt to empower the listener to provide the necessary and vital information, and ultimately to make sense of this nightmarish construct called reality. This will be a massive undertaking to present a broad array of informative material. We will begin with the fundamentals of psychological warfare to understand the hegemonic pyramid scheme that humanity has been under for countless eons. For Season 1, we will lay the foundation for what is to come. I'm ultimately reaching out to the truther community and the critically self-aware minority of the human species. I plan to do 10 episodes, or technically 11, because we did ultimately have a disorganized discussion. That was our first attempt. And I am undecided on how long we are planning these episodes to be. At minimal, we're aiming for an hour and 30 minutes, but this could go up to 3 or even 4 hours per episode. We will intend to set up a Patreon account and possibly a newsletter through email, as well as early access to our content. But the first season will be free. We are not shekel grabbers, and this is not an attempt for internet fame. We do not expect to be welcomed by mainstream or social media platforms. The information we are providing will be extremely controversial. We will not hold back, and potentially we may be putting our lives at risk, all for the sake of creating a ripple effect. For some of you, this information may not be anything new, specifically for those in the truther community, or you may feel compelled to listen just to brush up on what you already know. So much of what we are covering is open source information. As mentioned, this is an attempt at weaving together a culmination of informative material. We welcome you, the listener, to be a part of our grassroots movement, to empower the listener to free their minds from the grips of this mass manipulation program that happens to be the very life you are living, the world around you, etc. Thus, the first season is appropriately called The Desert of the Real. Oh, and we're not here to beat people over the head for their preconceptions or worldview. Whichever ideology, doctrine, savior you worship or subscribe to, or whichever label you place on yourself, is irrelevant. Our emphasis will be attempting to open your mind to different concepts and ideas. So now the introduction is out of the way. Now, welcome to the show, folks. I am going to be covering a broad array of information, but we're going to start simple for the first couple episodes. I'm thinking it would be more appropriate to start with 3 illustrious men in particular. Edward Bernay, the father of public relations, his legacy, as well as the work and life of Aldous Huxley, and last but not least, Bertrand Russell. I think these would be good starting points for getting a good understanding of psychological warfare, mass manipulation, propaganda, even throw in some brief mentions of Professor Noam Chomsky's documentary and book, Manufacturing Consent. So, starting off, I'm going to be narrating a couple of articles. As stated in the intro, most of this information will be open source. So right off the bat, This is just out in the open. You can do your own research. Don't take my word for it. Okay. Meet Edward Bernays, and this is an article from allthat'sinteresting.com. Meet Edward Bernays, the father of public relations who transformed consumer culture in America. As Sigmund Freud's nephew, and the article, of course, is by Marco Margaritoff, edited by Adam Farley. As Sigmund Freud's nephew, Edward Louis Bernays combined psychology with public relations to sell everything from bacon to cigarettes, and even a coup. Edward Bernays was a mere business consultant on the surface, but in practice he was a skilled surgeon of popular opinion. Bernays probed the depths of social behaviors and molded what the average American wanted, only to sell it back for use by corporations and governments of the early 20th century. He delivered ingenious tactics to tobacco companies and political figures eager to increase their sales and status. However, he would also use those same skills for more nefarious agendas like nationalist propaganda and foreign coup d'etats. What his uncle Sigmund Freud was to psychology, Bernays was to public relations. He studied human instinct like a hawk. He understood that people were driven by unconscious motivations, and that these could be exploited. A puppeteer of the press, Bernays is known as the father of public relations, but his legacy is more than that moniker may suggest. He not only satisfied corporate clients, he literally sold the American public on the 1954 coup d'etat orchestrated by the CIA and the United Fruit Company in Guatemala. Edward Bernays, life as Sigmund Freud's nephew. Edward Bernays was born on November 22, 1891 in Vienna, Austria. His family immigrated to New York when he was 2 years old. His mother, Anna Freud, who was a younger sister of the renowned psychoanalyst who shifted the field of psychiatry. His father, meanwhile, worked as a grain merchant in Manhattan's commodity exchanges, and Bernays attended Cornell University to follow in his footsteps, but it would not come to pass. Upon graduating, Bernays returned to New York with a curiosity for journalism that landed him at the Medical Review of Reviews. It was here that he realized how altering public discourse could shift opinion and change the world, and soon took that experience into work as a Broadway press agent. He began with the relatively simple scenarios. When a play about venereal disease lacked funding due to its controversial subject, Bernays set up a sociological fund committee. Suddenly, notable citizens paid to applaud the play as a noteworthy cause for public health, instead of as an obscenity. When World War I broke out, Bernays hoped to enlist, but was turned away for imperfect vision. His intellect was in high demand, however, and the newly established U.S. Information Agency hired him to promote America's reasons for entering the war. By 1918, he was working directly with President Woodrow Wilson at the Paris Peace Conference, the father of public relations. After the war, Bernays went into the consulting business, styling himself as a public relations consul. One of his first clients was Procter & Gamble, pretty major company with a long, extensive list of scandals, which employed his services for over 30 years. Tasked to promote their ivory soaps, Bernays orchestrated a survey to achieve favorable results that customers preferred white, unperfumed soap, and saw Procter & Gamble sales rise when the media reported this. He held a yacht race sponsoring the product in Central Park, and even had the National Household Service recommend families use pure white soap. The Ziegfeld Follies girls agreed to tout using nothing but warm water and pure white, unscented, floating soap on their faces. But it was a big leap from soap to his next endeavor, shaping a presidential election. And there is a photo in this particular article. Eleanor Roosevelt. Oh, God, don't get me started on the Roosevelts. Unlikable and stern on his surface, Calvin Coolidge hired Bernay to polish his image during his re-election campaign in 1924. Bernay organized a party on the White House lawn featuring contemporary superstars like Al Jolson. National papers picked up the story and portrayed Coolidge as a charming figure who was handily re-elected weeks later. His broadcast and deadliest campaign occurred in 1929. Smoking had been in vogue for years, but American women were seen as lower class for doing so. Bernay not only highlighted its supposed weight loss effects, but touted the action of smoking as a powerful declaration of freedom. Once more, the public event was set. Hiring models and actors for the Freedom Torches event, Bernay orchestrated the Fifth Avenue Easter Sunday parade in Manhattan with such precision that it was essentially scripted. His casting was precise, as were his directions on where to stand and how to smoke. Professional photographers were on hand to capture the glamour. The very next day, the American Tobacco Company saw its products praised in the New York Times. Page 1 news declared group of girls puff at cigarettes as a gesture of freedom. As a result, cigarette sales among women skyrocketed. Bernay had done his job. Now this gets into the United Fruits coup d'etat. Chronicling his insight into societal manipulation in 1928, Edward Bernay's propaganda is as ominous today as it was prophetic when he wrote it. He described the invisible tool as the modern instrument of powerful, intelligent men who must wield it in order to bring order out of chaos. Bernay would later claim, had I known in 1928 what I know today, he would have refused the American Tobacco Company's offer. But his insidious work in 1954, however, appeared a timeless act, a purposeful deceit, working for the United Fruits Company, now known as Chiquita. His machinations helped the CIA topple Guatemala's government. With a 90% share of the global banana market, United Fruits was such a powerful corporate entity in Central America that it held sway over Guatemala's government and popularized the term Banana Republic. When Democratic President Jacobo Arbenz came to power, however, the company lost substantial influence. Bernay, who had already helped create the Señorita Chiquita banana character for United Fruits, was now tasked to portray the leader negatively. He flew journalists out and curated their experiences there, showing how horrid the conditions were and that United Fruits was under siege by this new communist president. With fabricated spin littering, newspapers, and Bernay distributing those to high-ranking U.S. officials, Arbenz and his administration were so weakened that the CIA launched Operation PB Success, arming and training a liberation army led by an exiled Guatemalan military officer. And may I interject for a moment, there is also a documentary and research on the concept of economic hitmen, where the CIA was long since involved with private corporations, mega corporations, in meddling in the affairs of foreign governments, certainly across Central and South America, Southeast Asia, you name it. Getting back, led by an exiled Guatemalan military officer, the criminal regime change was only exposed in 1997. Edward Bernay's Legacy of Propaganda. By the time of John F. Kennedy's assassination on Edward Bernay's 72nd birthday, Bernay's had already impacted American culture and foreign relations with more vigor than any other public relations figure in modern history. His detractors, according to the New York Times, called him a glorified press agent at best, a young Machiavelli at worst. His legacy is one of extreme cunning, with his work guided not by any moral compass, but the mere demand of his clients. He formed the interest groups to manufacture consent and mold minds. His resume is both disturbing and stunning. He convinced Americans that only disposable cups were truly sanitary for Dixie Cup, another corporation. He advised New York City's mayor to appear tough on crime to get elected, a strategy still employed today. He pioneered the weaving of human instinct, capitalism, and crowd psychology together to create consumer habits and opinions that still linger even today. And he created a new subset of powerful influencers that has reverberated far beyond what he could have imagined when he died at the age of 103 in 1995. These parasites live long, don't they? The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Bernay wrote in his 1928 book, Propaganda, "Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds molded, our tastes are formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of." All right. Okay, and the next article we're moving towards is The Manipulation of the American Mind, Edward Bernay's, and the Birth of Public Relations. Now, a lot of what I'm going to be covering is going to be repetitious because, well, it's really the only way for people to get it into their minds. So I'm just going with this particular route for the time being. All right, the most interesting men in the world reach out and touch someone, finger-licking good. Such advertising slogans have become fixtures of American culture, and each year millions now tune into the Super Bowl as much as ads for football. While no single person can claim exclusive credit for the ascendancy of American advertising, no one
deserves credit more than a man most of us have never heard of, which is Edward Bernays, as previously mentioned. I first encountered Bernays through an article I was writing on propaganda, and it quickly became clear that he was one of the 20th century's foremost salesmen of ideas. The fact that 20 years have elapsed since his death provides a fitting opportunity to re-examine, or up to this point, closer to 30, a fitting opportunity to re-examine his legacy. Bernays pioneered public relations. Often referred to as the father of public relations, Bernays in 1928 published his seminal work, Propaganda, in which he argued that public relations is not a gimmick, but a necessity. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds molded, our taste formed, and our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. It is they who pull the wires that control the public mind. Bernays came by his beliefs honestly. Born in Austria, 1981, already went through that segment, the year Sigmund Freud published one of his early papers. Bernays was also Freud's nephew twice over. Okay, skipping along the article. The year after his birth, Bernays' family moved. Getting on. He went to Cornell University, eventually helping Woodrow Wilson administration promote the idea that U.S. efforts in World War I were intended to bring democracy into Europe. Here's the segment I'm looking for. Bernays rebrands propaganda. Having seen how effective propaganda could be during war, Bernays wondered whether it might prove equally useful during peacetime. Yet propaganda had acquired somewhat of a pejorative connotation, which would be further magnified during World War II. So Bernays promoted the term public relations, drawing on the insights of his uncle Sigmund Freud, a relationship Bernays was always quick to mention. He developed an approach he dubbed the engineering of consent. He provided leaders the means to control and regiment the masses according to our will, without their knowing about it. To do so, it was necessary to appeal not to the rational part of the mind, but the unconscious. Bernays acquired an impressive list of clients, ranging from manufacturers such as General Electric, Procter & Gamble, and the American Tobacco Company, to media outlets like CBS and even politicians such as Calvin Coolidge. To counteract President Coolidge's stiff image, Bernays organized the Pancake Breakfast and the White House concerts with Al Jolson and many other Broadway performers. Okay, skipping along, let me see. Okay, the Torches of Freedom, I've already covered that in particular. Here we go. In the 1920s, Joseph Goebbels became an avid admirer of Bernays and his writings, despite the fact Bernays was a Jew. When Goebbels became the Minister of Propaganda for the Third Reich, he sought to exploit Bernays' ideas to the fullest extent possible. For example, he created the fear cult around Adolf Hitler. Bernays learned that the Nazis were using his work in 1933 from a foreign correspondent for Hearst newspapers. He later recounted in his 1965 autobiography They were using my books as the basis for a destructive campaign against Jews in Germany. This shocked me, but I knew any human activity can be used for social purposes or misused for antisocial ones. What Bernay's writings furnish is not a principle or tradition by which to evaluate the appropriateness of propaganda, but simply a means of shaping public opinion for any purpose whatsoever, whether beneficial to human beings or not. This observation led Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter to warn President Franklin Roosevelt against allowing Bernays to play a leadership role in World War II, describing him and his colleagues as professional poisoners of the public mind, exploiters of foolishness, fanaticism, and self-interest. Today, we might call what Bernays pioneered a form of branding, but at its core, it represents little more than a particularly brazen set of techniques to manipulate people to get them to do your bidding. Its underlying purpose, in large part, is to make money, but by convincing people that they want something they do not need, Bernays sought to turn citizens and neighbors into consumers who use their purchasing power to propel themselves down the road to happiness. Without a moral compass, however, such a transformation promotes a patronizing and ultimately cynical view of human nature and human possibilities, one as likely to destroy lives as to build them up. All right, so, and that article was published July 9th, 2015 by Richard Gunderman. You can find it on, let's see, just moving forward, theconversation.com. So for the record, listeners, this is my first time really attempting at, creating a podcast. And this is just, for the most part, free flow. I'm just digging up articles, reading, doing narrations. The conversations will start when my colleague, Jonathan, or whichever alias he prefers to use, decides to get in on the action. He's in South Africa, and there are a lot of underlying things that he's having to deal with, such as power outages and so forth. But this is really just me looking up open source information and tying together, connecting the dots, etc. We will be diving in more so into key concepts like perception management, social engineering, mass manipulation, population control. You will see how all of this ties together to the point where I won't even have to get into the last couple of years for people to tie it together in their own minds. Really, the core of this is I'm trying to get people to think critically. For those who are in really just the margin of self-awareness and they understand that something is wrong about the world around them, this is me just laying the foundation. Another article I came across you might find interesting. It's just a little side note. The grand uncle of the co-founder of Netflix on propaganda. This is an article by Hamad Subani, last updated on October 17th, 2020. Okay, so let me see, getting past this particular quote that I've already covered a few times. All right. It was founded by Reed Hastings. Okay, let me see. Netflix's two founders are heavily related to those in fields of weaponry and war. Information, signaling, and detection, television, politics, brainwaves, public broadcasting, intelligence agencies, psychology, and propaganda. This is probably not a coincidence, you think? I've been thinking a lot recently about how Netflix has a lot of really fucked up programming that seems designed to enculture us into certain things. Prison being fun is a big one I've been noticing, so I was looking into their original shows and thought it was strange that their very first bit of original programming was House of Cards. Then I decided to look up the founders, and hoo boy, does it get fucked up. I was founded by Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph. The first of the founders, Hastings, is the great-grandson of Alfred Lee Loomis and Ellen Holman Farnsworth. Loomis was an investment banker and scientist involved in development of radar and the atomic bomb, and also helped develop the electroencephalogram and studied brainwaves with it. His laboratory was a meeting place for many very famous scientists like Einstein, Fermi, Bohr, Heisenberg. His cousin was Henry L. Stimson, the Secretary of War for President Taft and FDR, and Truman, the Secretary of State for Hoover, and who oversaw the Manhattan Project. Interesting side note with my personal family history. My grandfather actually was contracted for the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos, but that's a whole other story. One of Alfred Lee Loomis's children, Henry Loomis, Reed Hastings' granduncle, was the director for The Voice of America under Eisenhower, and president of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting under Nixon, both of which are public broadcasting arms of the U.S. government, foreign and domestic respectively. Henry Loomis also directed research for the United States Information Agency and served on the board of MITRE Corporation. MITRE Corporation, keep that one in the back of your head, who worked with the CIA and DoD. Alfred Lee Loomis also predicted the Great Depression and bought a ton of gold beforehand, then got even richer by buying stocks of companies at their lowest. In a final point that I need to confirm, his wife, Ellen Holman Farnsworth, has the same surname as Philo Farnsworth, inventor of the television, and I'm pretty sure they are related. The second founder, Randolph, has connections that are perhaps even crazier. His great-granduncle is Sigmund fucking Freud, pioneer of psychology who studied unconscious desires that control people, the effects of trauma, the effects of childhood incidents, etc. Even more insane is Randolph's granduncle, Edward Bernays, the Austrian-American who was heavily involved in the field of propaganda and who basically started the modern field of public relations. He worked in PR for the United Fruit Company, who was also involved with the CIA's overthrow of Guatemala's democratically elected government in 1954. Here are some quotes about how Bernays felt about propaganda and the common man. Direct quotes in bold. Bernays argued that covert use of third parties was morally legitimate because those parties were morally autonomous actors. If we understand the mechanism and motives of the group mind, is it not possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without their knowing about it? The recent practice of propaganda has proved that it is possible, at least up to a certain point, and within certain limits, he later called this scientific technique of opinion molding, the engineering of consent. The phrase quite simply means that the use of an engineering approach that is action-based only on thorough knowledge of the situation and on the application of scientific principles and tried practices to task of getting people support ideas and programs. Instead of a mind, universal literacy has given the common man a rubber stamp. A rubber stamp inked with advertising, slogans, editorials, with published scientific data, with the trivialities of tabloids and the profundities of history, but quite innocent of original thought. Each man's rubber stamp is the twin of millions of others, so that when these millions are exposed to the same stimuli, all receive identical imprints. The amazing readiness with which large masses accept this process is probably accounted for by the fact that no attempt is made to convince them that black is white. Instead, their preconceived hazy ideas that a certain gray is almost black or almost white are brought into sharper focus. Their prejudices, notions, and convictions used as a starting point, with the result that they are drawn by a thread into passionate adherence to a given mental picture. Bernay's vision was of a utopian society in which individuals' dangerous, libidinal energies, the psychic and emotional energies associated with the instinctual, biological drives that Bernay's viewed as inherently dangerous, could be harnessed and channeled by a corporate elite for economic benefit through the use of mass production. Big business could fulfill the cravings of what Bernay saw as the inherently irrational and desire-driven masses, simultaneously securing the niche of a mass production economy, even in peacetime, as well as sating what he considered to be dangerous animal urges that threatened to tear society apart if left unquelled. Bernay touted the idea that the masses are driven by factors outside their conscious understanding, and therefore that their minds can and should be manipulated by the capable few. Intelligent men, this is Bernay's quoting, intelligent men must realize that propaganda is the modern instrument by which they can fight for productive ends and help to bring order out of chaos. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of the country. And this is further getting into the quote. We are governed, our minds molded, our taste formed, our ideas suggested largely by men we have never heard of. Later on in this series, we will be getting into BlackRock and Vanguard, the two giant hedge fund corporations. But, sorry, I was just interjecting for a moment. This is a logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. Vast numbers of human beings must cooperate in this manner if they are to live together as a smoothly functioning society. In almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct, our ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires, which control the public mind. All right, picking back up from where we left off. Okay, so now it's time. We covered a little bit the basics with Edward Bernay's, the father of public relations, so-called. Now we're getting into the life and work of Huxley, and a little bit of Orwell, but there's an interesting article I feel the need to cover. 1984 versus Brave New World. Which dystopian nightmare is likely to come true? By Ben Barty at Armageddon Prose. Scorched Earth Independent Journalism is the website. Originally published via the Daily Bell. That the human population is hurtling towards dystopia is at breakneck speed is a foregone conclusion by this point. The tea leaves read red with human pain and suffering. The deeper question remains, will the coming authoritarian hellscape be more like Mad Max, kill, rape, pillage, scorched earth style, or more lobotomized, institutionalized, submissively, heavily medicated style? In dystopian literary terms, will the horrific anti-human engineered society of tomorrow be more to resemble the vision of George Orwell's 1984 or Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which I would argue would be a combination of the two, and you could even throw in Logan's Run, for the record, a story where nobody is allowed to live past the age of 30, and they live in this beautiful utopian little enclosed bubble of a technocratic city, which, of course, now we're seeing the rise of the 15-minute cities, the UN Habitat smart cities. And don't worry, folks, they're going to give many different names. They're going to constantly keep people guessing. A lot of people are focusing their emphasis on the World Economic Forum, for example. This particular group, however, is only one of many. It's more like a humiliation ritual, where world leaders, billionaire oligarchs, the global elites come out and just overtly preach the absurd dystopian garbage they want to enforce on all of us, under the guise of egalitarianism, philanthropy, whatever. I mean, if, just for starters, if you hear the words billionaire and philanthropist in a sentence and a red flag doesn't go up in the back of your head, I think this podcast may not be for you. But getting back to the article, I read the first quarter of 1984 for the first time at 15 years of age in the shed behind my father's house in Topeka, Kansas. On top of that family lawnmower, his wife at the time had banished me from the house, so there I sat at dusk under dim light from a single light bulb in the corner. Things were dark. The human misery of Winston's world leapt from the pages in crystal clear notes. 1984, in everyday parlance, is synonymous with the ethos that the novel's brutal ruling class, the prevailing ideology of the state depicted by Orwell, was summarized in its arguably most haunting quote delivered by agent of the state, O'Brien, as he tortures the protagonist, Winston. If you want a vision of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face. Forever. Police state, ruled by cop, is the standard concern when most civil libertarians discuss authoritarian overreach because it is the most visible, most obvious form of a government power grab. The party of 1984, the state, pursues power not as a means to an end, but as an end entirely of itself. The pressing forever on the nerve of power. That is the world that we are preparing, Winston, a world of victory after victory, triumph after triumph after triumph. An endless pressing upon the nerve of power. It is violent and beyond that celebratory, of violence in a religious fashion. That is the rawest expression of state power, rather than words which Big Brother seeks to ultimately eliminate. Brutality is the native language of the party in Orwell's visions. And just as a quick backdrop for both Huxley and Orwell, Orwell was a member of the British Socialist Fabian Society, and Huxley happened to be a member of the Tavistock Institute. These two organizations had very close ties and very similar ends. The Tavistock Institute was more of a scientific rationalist technocrat, whereas the Fabian Society took more of a socialist, but more elitist approach. They both sort of come to a middle ground when we start diving into these think tanks, organizations, of which there are many. And the Frankfurt School also has a legacy in this regarding the culture war that we are facing today. The whole woke movement, what some people more familiar with it are calling cultural Marxism. And this is ultimately, a new age communist socialist system with flowers masquerading under a technocratic elite system, which will ultimately be, as for people who will become familiar with Nikki Rapana's work. She passed away last year, God rest her soul. She wrote Our Common Destiny, a manifesto on communitarianism. And most people have never come across the term communitarianism, I assume. But I will be getting into it. Brendan O'Connell, the political dissident, who runs his own channel, has discussed it in depth, along with other conspiratorial matters, which are in fact occurring and really just out in the open at this point. All I'm really trying to do here is lay the foundation work for people to understand that this has been an ongoing transition to where we are today and where we are likely heading in the next decade. Okay, getting back to the article. As history has repeatedly demonstrated through raw force alone, has never so far proven sufficient to maintain control over a population forever. Eventually, no volume or degree brutally visited upon the population, nor tactical infiltration of subversive elements, nor any amount of censorship can hold back the state's inevitable destruction at the hands of an enraged populace. And of course, the powers that be are trying to remedy this. Another way you could put communitarianism is inclusive capitalism, crony capitalism for the elites, and more of a degraded, de-evolved mass of a human worker slave population. which we are seeing. We're seeing people get dumbed down to the extent where most people don't know their basic geography. Most people aren't critically self-aware enough to know how they're being manipulated, the various means, ends, methodologies that are employed from the day they're born, the educational system, pop culture, media, endless brainwashing, consumer culture, society. People have become very complacent, lazy, and are more or less accepting the terms that are being imposed on them. If the last couple of years with the restrictions and mandates have not been clear enough for people, don't worry. It will get worse. You have your little brief moment of comfort and sunshine as it stands. But I assure you, there will be another crisis, another engineered catastrophic event in whatever form. We've had our 9/11s, we've had our pandemics. Don't worry. I'm speculating that definitely at the core of what's coming next will be climate change. That will be the sole central emphasis on how they implant tighter restrictions and control on the populace. Okay, returning back to the article. This is the premise on which Orwell and Huxley part ways in their predictions of what form future totalitarianism will take. A really efficient totalitarian state would be one in which the all-powerful executive political bosses and their army of managers control a population of slaves who do not have to be coerced because they love their servitude. In a remarkable letter pinned on Orwell following the publication of 1984, Huxley further explains this theoretical divergence. Within the next generation, I believe that the world's rulers will discover that the lust for power can be just as completely satisfied by suggesting people into loving their servitude as by flogging and kicking them into obedience. History explains this split in part. George Orwell gained his political insights, which were undeniable in their piercing illumination laid bare by the plain language of his writing, from his time spent serving in the British Empire in the waning days of its global dominance. His vision of the ruling class of Oceania was ripped from the pages of the British colonial history, just taken to its logical, absurd, and brutal conclusion. Contrarily, Huxley ran in the circles of the behavioral science wing of the ruling class that oversaw the Industrial Revolution, the ones obsessed with the unprecedented potential of Pavlovian conditioning applied at a scale to control entire populations. This is where Huxley's vision, arguably more horrific than the brutality of life in 1984's Oceania, bears fruit in the modern context. Rule through brutality, the central modus operandi of 1984's inner party, is the past. The future ruling class, as Huxley illustrated, will instead prop itself up through social conditioning and medicalization. You could call it the pharmacological method as well. Hint, hint. Medicalization can be defined as the process by which some aspects of human life come to be considered as medical problems, whereas before they were not considered pathological. Toxic masculinity, white fragility, 5 distinct classes of anxiety disorders, 7 classes of depression, gender dysphoria. Even in children as young as 2 years old, these are the products of medicalization. In Brave New World, the entire population takes a fictitious sedative called soma multiple times a day. It is the cure for any pain or discomfort, no matter how mild. Here is a quote from the book. She had inconspicuously swallowed 0.5 gram of soma, with the result that she could now sit, serenely, not listening, thinking of nothing at all, but with her large blue eyes fixed on the warden's face in an expression of rapt attention. This sounds familiar. You may think to yourself, in the 21st century America, we almost instinctively look to a mental health care professional for help with nihilism and despair and uncertainty. In turn, they medicate you. The U.S. population is awash in prescription drugs to heal spiritual black holes. Every year, millions of Americans fill prescriptions for psychotropic drugs like Xanax, Valium, Ativan, Klonopin, Lexapro, Effexor, Zoloft, Adderall, Abilify. Ask your doctor about fill in the blank. And yet, despite spending more per capita on healthcare than any other nation on earth, we remain in spiritual psychosis. For your problems, you get an avalanche of pills down your throat and injections into your veins. If one healthcare solution won't work, they prescribe another and another until you are numb, until you transition into the walking dead, a shadow of your former self, until you are subdued, docile, until you are compliant. This is spiritual warfare, and the slaves taken in the silent conquest don't know they are captured, living out their lives in ignorant, medicated bliss. The evil genius of the social engineers is on full display in the sad, well, I can't really read this term. It won't last. If I read what I'm, this won't last on YouTube more than a day. It has to do with a medical procedure that was mandated in the last few years. I'll leave people to speculate. Okay. Profile pictures of those who have grown to love their servitude all across social media. I'm sure you've seen this in the past couple of years. And in the slew of pill bottles littering your mother's medicine cabinet. Read the worthy, brave new world and learn for whom and what and to what end you suffer. Then kill your masters as proper repayment for the future they stole from you. Now, I am not in any way advocating violence. Not in any capacity. I am, however, saying that the cost of your civil liberties, the cost of your freedom, has no price. All right, beginning again. This article is from ivn.us. Published the 12th of August, 2014. The Forgotten Political Legacy of Aldous Huxley. November 22nd, 1963, we are often reminded, was the day of John Fitzgerald Kennedy's assassination, and an entire generation lost its innocence. Unfortunately, Lee Harvey Oswald's bullets inadvertently claimed another victim that same day. In a hospital in California, the writer Aldous Huxley passed away after 3 years of battling throat cancer. Due to the events in Dallas, Huxley did not receive the obituary or remembrance he deserved in history. History, however, has shown that his impact on American politics and culture far outweighed and outlasted even JFK's legacy. And for those of you, I highly recommend people try to look for JFK's or basically open speech on secret societies or secrecy. It was his controversial speech not too long before his assassination. Huxley was born in Britain in 1894. And by the time he moved to Los Angeles in 1937 to live out the latter half of his life, he had already achieved literary greatness. In 1932, his dystopian novel, Brave New World, was published. The novel was a smashing success, a prediction of a society lulled into complacent servility by material consumption, endless amusements, and the illusion of choice and artificial happiness tugs at Americans' consciousness to this day. The book is widely listed as required reading in American high schools and is often read together with George Orwell's 1984. While Brave New World remains his most widely read novel, the full measure of Huxley's impact on American culture must include what he wrote after his move to Southern California, particularly The Doors of Perception in 1953. It, in addition to the writings that followed, served as the intellectual starting block of the counterculture of the 1960s, the political impact which is felt till this day. Soon after arriving in Los Angeles, Huxley was introduced to Eastern philosophy, including variations of Hinduism and Buddhism, ideas of meditation, enlightenment, self-realization, and other transcendental tenets of Eastern thought, which permeated the rest of his life's work. Huxley was simultaneously introduced to hallucinogenic supplements like mescaline and later lysergic acid diethylamide, or otherwise known as LSD. Huxley was introduced to mescaline in 1953 by Dr. Humphrey Osmond, a British psychiatrist who was researching it. On May 5th, of that year, he invited Osmond to his home, where he was administered a small dosage of mescaline and proceeded to embark upon an 8-hour trip. A few months later, Huxley finished The Doors of Perception, a first-person account of his experience. What made the book a sensation in literary, scientific, and cultural circles was not only Huxley's account of his trip, but also his explicit endorsement of mescaline's use. I am not so foolish as to equate what happens under the influence of mescaline or of any other drug, prepared or in the future preparable, with the realization of the end and ultimate purpose of human life, enlightenment, the beatific vision. All I am suggesting is that the mescaline experience is what Catholic theologians call a gratuitous grace, not necessarily to salvation, but potentially helpful to be accepted, thankfully, if made available, to be shaken out of the ruts of ordinary perception, to be shown for a few timeless hours the outer and the inner world, not as they appear to an animal obsessed with survival or to a human being obsessed with words and notions, but as they are apprehended directly and unconditionally by mind at large. This is an experience of inestimable value to everyone, and especially to the intellectual. Now, I am in no way promoting the use of, hallucinogenic drugs or whatever else. I mean, be it mescaline, LSD, psilocybin, shrooms. But for some people, they could potentially be therapeutic. I certainly, hypothetically, and, may have had my own experiences in dealing with these. But moving along. Theologians, both Christian and Eastern, criticized Huxley's endorsement, but others included scientists and psychiatrists who supported his conclusions. The book, more importantly, kicked off a series of events that would help lay the foundation of the counterculture in the 1960s. Huxley immediately became a counterpiece of a network of scholars that researched and advocated for the use of hallucinogens. He kept a correspondence with Humphrey Osmond, who in one of his newsletters, Huxley wrote, "To fathom hell are sore angelic. Just take a pinch of a psychedelic." Okay, psychedelic quickly became the adopted word for the experience induced by mescaline and LSD, and would become a popular term among San Franciscans during the 1967 Summer of Love. In 1960, Dr. Timothy Leary befriended Huxley after reading The Doors of Perception. Leary would later be the country's foremost advocate of LSD and invited the country to turn on, tune in, and drop out. 2 years after Huxley's death, a UCLA student by the name of Jim Morrison read The Doors of Perception, inspired his newly formed band, began billing themselves as The Doors. A lot of people don't know that. To be sure, Huxley would have disagreed with Leary's attitude toward LSD. Huxley envisioned the use of psychedelics as a supplemental support for a learned individual's journey to the Enlightenment and accessing the mind at large, not as a means of dropping out of consciousness, though Huxley would inspire them. He was no hippie. Huxley continued to write on Eastern thought and psychedelics, refining and clarifying his views along the way. His thinking culminated in his last novel, Island, 1962, a utopian response to Brave New World. Huxley describes a fictional Southeast Asian island called Pala that operates on a fusion of Buddhism and Western Enlightenment thought. The residents place an emphasis on meditation, once in a while supplementing it with a hallucinogenic substance called moksha, a fictionalized version of LSD, being fully human and living in harmony with nature. The society is non-hierarchical, pacific, and communal. Island would help to serve as a blueprint for the founders and organizers of communes and intentional communities, some of which remain in operation today. In all, many of the ideas and even terminology of the American counterculture originate in Aldous Huxley's writings. His musings on Eastern thought, ecology, non-hierarchical societies, and psychedelic drugs made him a one-man vanguard of the counterculture, the political impact of which defines much of today's political landscape. Today's ideas of sustainable living, production, environmentalism, and cooperative living are progenies of Huxley's thinking. Surely there is one more man we should be commemorating every November. And this article was Produced by Joshua Alvarez. Okay. Writer and journalist living in Palo Alto, California. Palo Alto! Quite a city. I'll get into that a little bit later. All right. So we are moving along. So this is... All right, and the next article. Brave New World predicted today's world better than any other novel. This is from bigthink.com. His book warns us of the dangers of mass media, passivity, and how even an intelligent population can be driven to gladly choose dictatorship over freedom. All right. Key takeaways. This 1931 novel predicted modern life almost to a Model T. While other dystopias get more press, Brave New World offers us a nightmare world that we've moved steadily towards over the last century. Author Aldous Huxley's ideas on a light-handed totalitarian dictatorship stand in marked contrast to the popular image of a dictatorship that relies on force. When most people think of what dystopia our society is sprinting towards, they tend to think of 1984, The Handmaid's Tale, or The Hunger Games. These top-selling, well-known, and well-written titles are excellent warnings of the worlds that could come to pass that we would all do well to read. However, one lesser-known dystopian novel has done a much better job at predicting the future than these three books. Brave New World, written in 1931 by author and psychonaut and philosopher Aldous Huxley, is well known, but hasn't quite had the pop culture breakthrough that the other three did. This is regrettable and very likely intentional, as it offers us a detailed image of a dystopia that our society is not only moving towards, but would be happy to have. Henry Ford with his Model T. Okay, let's see. For those who haven't read it, Brave New World is the description of a nightmare society where everybody is perfectly happy all the time. This is assured through the destroying of free will of most of the population using genetic engineering, Pavlovian conditioning, and keeping everyone entertained continuously with endless distractions, and offering a plentiful supply of the wonder drug Soma to keep people happy if all else fails. The world state is a dictatorship which strives to assure order. The dictatorship is managed by 10 oligarchs who rely on an extensive bureaucracy to keep the world running. The typical person is conditioned to love their subservience and either to be proud of the vital work they do or be relieved that they don't have to worry about the problems of the world. Global stability is ensured through the Fordist religion, which is based on the teachings of Henry Ford and Sigmund Freud and involves the worship of both men. The tenets of this faith encourage mass consumerism, sexual promiscuity, and avoiding unhappiness at all cost. The assembly line is praised as though it were a gift from God. Huxley's dystopia is especially terrifying in that the enslaved population absolutely loves their slavery. Even the characters who are smart enough to know what is going on and why they should be concerned are instead content with everything that is happening. Perhaps more terrifying than other dystopian novels, in Brave New World, there is truly no hope for change. The similarities between the world of today and the world of the book are many, even if our technology hasn't quite caught up yet. While the human assembly line described in the first part of the story is still a far-off fantasy. Is it? The basic concepts that make it work are already here. Today, people make choices to influence the genetic makeup of their children regularly. Prenatal screenings has created the ability for many parents to decide if they wish to carry a disabled fetus to term or not. In Iceland, this has resulted in the near eradication of new diseases of Down syndrome in the country. Almost 100% of detected cases lead to abortion shortly after. Similarly, testing for a child's sex before birth is a well-known procedure that leads to a wide gender gap in many countries. Less well-known is the process of sperm sorting, which allows for a couple to choose the gender of their child as part of the process of in vitro fertilization. The above examples suggest we're open to soft eugenics already. Imagine what would happen if people could determine their child's potential IQ before birth, or how rebellious they would be as a teenager. It would be difficult to suggest that the development of such technology would not be hailed as progress by those who could afford to use it. Huxley's visions of a genetically perfected upper caste might be available soon. As this article suggests, some choice in baby design is already here, and more will be available soon. The characters of Brave New World enjoy endless distractions between their hours at work. Various complex games have been invented. Movies now engage all five senses, and there are even televisions at the feet of deathbeds. Nobody ever has to worry about being bored for long. The idea of enjoying solitude is taboo, and most people go out to parties every night. In our modern society, most people genuinely can't go 30 minutes without wanting to check their phones. We have, just as Huxley predicted, made it possible to abolish boredom and time for spare thoughts, no matter where you are. This is already having measurable effects on our mental health and our brain structure. Huxley wasn't warning us against watching television or going to the movies occasionally. He says in this interview with Mike Wallace that TV can be harmless, but rather against the constant barrage of distraction becoming more important in our lives than facing the problems that affect us. Given how stressful people find the idea of a tech-free day, and how we take our pop culture so seriously that it was targeted for use by Russian bots, he might have been onto something. Brave New World's favorite pill. Soma is quite the drug. In small doses, it causes euphoria. In moderate doses, it causes enjoyable hallucinations. In large doses, it is a tranquilizer. It is probably a pharmacological impossibility, but his concept of a society that pops pills to eradicate any vestige of negative feelings and escape the doldrums of the day is very real. While it seems odd to say that we are moving towards Brave New World in this era, when official policy is opposing drug use, Huxley would suggest we consider it a blessing, since a dictatorship that encouraged drug use to zonk out their population would be a powerful if light-handed one. While today we have a war on drugs, it is not on all drugs. Plus, the war on drugs is just a state-controlled monopoly in and of itself. It's intelligence agencies work close in hand with organized crime syndicates, cartels. That's a whole other subject. Antidepressants, a powerful tool for the treatment of mental illness, are so popular that 1/8 of Americans are on them right now. This doesn't include the large number of Americans on tranquilizers, anti-anxiety medications, or those who self-medicate with alcohol or increasingly legal marijuana. These drugs aren't quite soma, but they bear striking resemblance in function and use. In the book, the stability of the world state is partly based on total employment. A character informs us that automation has been purposely stalled to assure everyone can work, since free time would give them enough extra time to think about their condition. Well, yeah, I gotta say it was a little bit off with that, because we are heading towards a fourth industrial automated society. Advancements in AI and supercomputing will basically pave the dystopian hell we're heading towards. But it will masquerade as a beautiful utopian paradise, and the majority of people will fall for it. Mass employment relies on mass consumption, however, and numerous systems are in place to assure everyone keeps using new products, even when they don't need anything. Consumerism is a significant element in all major economies today. While it makes sense that a company would have an incentive to keep us buying things to remain profitable, Huxley's point is that consumerism can also be used to keep us pointlessly chasing after items we think we need to be happy, as a distraction from exploring other pursuits. While Huxley thought a dictatorship would have to condition people to want to buy new things and throw out last year's products to buy similar but newer ones, the lines and fights at Black Friday sales suggest otherwise. Are the lines for every new release of the iPhone. And just in case you thought it was only corporations getting in on the pressure, don't forget George Bush wanted you to fight terror by shopping. In our modern lives, a similar view on happiness as exists in the novel is developing. In his book, The Happiness Industry, William Davies argues that modern capitalism has come across the concept of making happiness the only acceptable mental state and run with it to make more money. Our newfound slew of corporate happiness officers and self-help gurus are all designed to keep us happy, consuming, and unwilling to question the larger system in place, he argues. This notion is summarized in his book, 1. Jargon-laden sentence. The relentless fascination with quantities of subjective feeling can only possibly divert critical attention away from broader political and economic problems. While claims that we are redefining happiness as unacceptable might seem overblown, the Standard Manual of Mental Illness now says grieving for deceased loved ones more than a few days is problematic. Perhaps Mr. Davies is on to something. Okay. Have to look into that part. Huxley expressed concern in his follow-up book, Brave New World Revisited, that the increasing complexity of technology and global problems had led to a concentration of power, both in business and government. This concentration, he argued, not only made people more comfortable with the idea of being subjugated, but also made dictatorship easier to enact. Today, we have a higher concentration of wealth and power than ever before. In the United States, the top 1% are richer than ever. 6 corporations hold 90% of the media. And I would argue the 2 giant hedge funds help tie that together even more so. And the power of undemocratic institutions such as corporations like the Atlantic Council, a few others, are Byzantine bureaucracies are greater than ever before. Many Americans choose not to vote and have the same influence on their government that they would if they had no right to vote. This can lead to situations little different than that of 1984, but without the hard totalitarian edge that came with it. In 1984, there was only one television station, and there was no attempt to hide the fact that the government controlled it. In the United States today, dozens of seemingly different networks are controlled by only a few conglomerates, and often promote the same worldview and opinions as a result. Huxley himself warned against this very situation when he talked about how we were approaching his dystopia back in 1958. Well, at the present, the television, I think, is being used quite harmlessly. It's being used, I would feel it's being used too much to distract everybody all the time. But I mean, imagine, which must be the situation in all communist countries where the television, where it exists, is always saying the same things all the time. It's always driving along. It's not creating a wide front of distraction. It's creating a one-pointed drumming into a single idea all the time. It's obviously an immensely powerful instrument. My, how far we've come. Despite being able to find this out or turn the channel, millions of people willingly continue to watch what might be called propaganda from friendly faces. Indeed, they love it. This soft totalitarianism is often hard to detect or state an objection to, which Slavoj Žižek argues is the point. Huxley thought we could save ourselves, though we had to act quickly. While his concerns around overpopulation and eugenics have been shown to be debunked by the march of history, his other ideas still have merit. In his follow-up book, Brave New World Revisited, he argues the decentralization of power as a means to restore the value of democratic government to the typical person who might otherwise realize their vote is meaningless and lose faith in democracy as a result. He suggests that we can better educate people for freedom by drawing their attention to the methods of demagogues and sleazy advertisers. He encouraged those seeking freedom to move to the countryside or to establish stronger neighborhood ties. In the cities, to resist the pressure to only engage with others as an economic unit and not as a full human being. He was also warm to the ideas of syndicalism and worker cooperatives, which seek to restructure workplaces to feature workers democratically managing them. He saw this as both a way to decentralize the economy and improve democratic participation. Aldous Huxley's Brave New World was a prediction of a nightmare he thought we would be safe from for at least a few hundred years when he wrote it in 1931. By the end of 1958, he realized he had been very optimistic. While we aren't entirely doomed to the pleasant slavery he envisioned quite yet, the march of progress continues to bring us the tools which to make it ever simpler to enact. If we will make the choices needed to avoid it, or if we will willingly cry out to be saved from our freedom, remains to be answered.
All right, picking up where we left off, I feel that it's important to incorporate the history of Sullivan and Cromwell and the Dulles brothers. This article found on Unbranded News. The Dulles brothers changed the 20th century, but have you heard of them? By Chadwick Mixon. The American 20th century saw change on an unprecedented level. 2 world wars and the Great Depression, the institution of the Federal Reserve, the rise of the CIA, the Cold War, the Kennedy assassination, the list goes on and on. We are still dealing with the products of events from the 20th century today, and it is likely we will continue to do so for many years. But throughout these years, we the people still controlled what happened, or did we? What if I told you that 2 brothers that you might have heard of had their hands in nearly every major American event from 1918 to 1970? What if I told you that these 2 brothers were never elected to any public office? Who am I talking about, you ask? The Dulles brothers, John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles. That's who. But before we get into the nitty-gritty stuff, let's set the scene. The Dulles brothers were shaped by the same forces that shaped this country. And when we understand one set of these forces, we ultimately understand the other. The Dulles brothers were raised in an environment of privilege. Their grandfather, John Watson Foster, had been Secretary of State under Benjamin Harrison. Their uncle, Robert Lansing, was also Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson. Before they had ever even left home, it was not uncommon for them to sit at the same dinner table as President Grover Cleveland, President William Howard Taft, or the famed businessman Bernard Baruch. This upbringing instilled a sense of American exceptionalism in the Dulles boys. They had always been around great American businessmen, politicians, teachers. So, to them, at all times, the world needed a strong America, with the ability to influence the rest of the world. As a young boy of 8 or 9, Allen Dulles would even draft intelligence reports to himself after attending dinner parties held by his grandfather. The brothers were raised as devout missionary Christians. Their families' church philosophy insisted upon the adherence, participation, in convincing the rest of the world that its various other religions were wrong. that their faith and their faith alone provides the one true way into paradise. If one understands and believes this concept, it isn't a leap to assume that one could believe the same about other type of systems, like politics. The Dulles brothers strongly believed that their way of governance and politics was the only way. The brothers spent a large part of their youth participating in the very influential law firm Sullivan and Cromwell. They were constantly put on the defense of major American corporations. This consistently reinforced the idea that American businesses were under attack all the time, though they only wanted to spread the wonderful and prosperous tenets of business and freedom. Okay, place. Versailles, France. The First World War was at an end. The first truly global conflict that had taken the lives of over 17 million people was finally over. Germany, the major aggressor in the conflict, was broken down and weak. The pressing issue now was to decide how to deal with Germany. The cost of World War I were heavy, and no Western country was eager to have to pay their war debt. The Treaty of Versailles was a long and arduous process, one of many treaties that was drafted after World War I. The Treaty of Versailles is definitely the most famous. Sadly, among scholarly circles, the Treaty of Versailles is not known for its effectiveness or its brilliance. Rather, the Treaty of Versailles is known as both the end of World War I and the instigation of the aggressive European environment that inevitably led to World War II. While the German government eventually capitulated and signed the treaty, the terms were anything but easy to swallow. Alongside the immediate ceasefire that was required, the German government had to agree to pay back the Allied nations German marks, which would amount to today 33 billion American dollars. In 1919, 200 billion American dollars in 2015, from the time this article was published. Even the great economist John Maynard Keynes calculated that it would take Germany until at least 1988, over 70 years, from the end of World War I to pay back the decided amount. All right. This eventual agreement to pay back such a tremendous amount of money would later be used as fuel to the fire of National Socialism. And Adolf Hitler himself would talk about the great unfairness of such a requested sum. Now, what does the Treaty of Versailles have to do with the two brothers, John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles? They helped draft the treaty as fledgling lawyers of the immensely powerful law firm Sullivan and Cromwell. The Dulles brothers were an integral part of the process that both milked a weak Germany of the little resources it had and led to the start of an even larger conflict, World War II. A few years after the end of the First Great War, the Union Banking Corporation was founded in New York City. New York, its board members included Prescott Bush, German steel magnate Fritz Thyssen, and the son of a railroad tycoon, E.H. Harriman, also a member of Skull and Bones, and Averill. Okay. This bank was used to hold some of the money that would eventually help the German economy recover during the 1930s. Still operating as lawyers, the Dulles brothers represented the bank for almost 2 decades. This relationship ended in 1942, in the midst of World War II. Once the UBC and its holdings were seized by the United States government under the Trading with the Enemy Act, the funds traveled through the Wall Street Bank were the funds that traveled through the Wall Street Bank were considered earned from business and trade that aided the nation of Germany during a time of war. In franker terms, they were treasonous, although the bank was seized through a declaration of aiding the enemy. No serious criminal charges were ever levied against the board of directors. While the Dulles brothers did not deal in day-to-day operations inside the UBC, they did know and defend the actions of the bank that verifiably aided Adolf Hitler's Nazi movement in times of war. Alan Dulles would close their firm's dealings in Berlin by 1935 against his brother's wishes, but their support and representation of UBC would outlast the war. Time: 1953, place Tehran, Iran. Not long after the end of World War II, conflicts around the world were igniting that would pit the two remaining world powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, against each other in emerging nations in South America and the Middle East. And for me to interject for just a moment, the work of Major Jordan's diaries and Professor Anthony Sutton, if you want to know the real scoop on the Cold War. I'll be getting into that later on. After a democratic election of Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh and his administration's successful nationalization of Iran's oil reserves, a secret operation was planned in the newly formed CIA, which conveniently was headed by the younger Dulles brother. In a seriously dark and dangerous move, the CIA planned to bribe Iranian politicians, falsely associate supporters of Mossadegh as violent and disrespectful of the country's past, and eventually help place the former prime minister into political exile. This plan was given the name Operation Ajax and was conceived with serious cooperation from the Eisenhower administration. Although touted in the beginning as a good move, the coup d'etat has been historically labeled one of the worst foreign policy decisions in recent memory. While profiting the West in the beginning, the distrust that grew from the situation has bred resentment and anger for the U.S. in entire generations of Iranians. The eventual Iranian Revolution of 1979 is seen as a direct product of Operation Ajax, and shockwaves from the event still create massive headaches for the United States and its allies till this day. Time: 1961. Place: the Bay of Pigs. Cuba. Another infamous blunder of the intelligence community, the Bay of Pigs invasion was hastily planned and poorly executed. Dealing with fierce opposition from the newly elected Kennedy administration, the CIA and Alan Dulles, by that time the agency's director, were extremely determined to go ahead with the plan to invade the Cuban mainland and depose the newly seated communist revolutionary Fidel Castro. JFK specifically stated that he would only supply 8 planes to the Cuban exiles, and they would not be loaded with weapons, only necessary supplies. Without the full support of the U.S. military, the exile forces were quickly decimated and most were taken prisoner. Dulles' sister would later claim that Allen had shown early signs of dementia and what she believed to be Alzheimer's disease, contributing to the lack of leadership and foresight her brother seemed to have in the waning years of his heading the organization. This explanation, although it seems to make sense, was never professionally determined, but was corroborated by some of Dulles' other professional colleagues. Shortly after Kennedy would dismiss Dulles from his dictatorship position and famously claim to tear the CIA into 1,000 pieces and throw it to the wind, the Bay of Pigs operation shattered any chance of negotiation with Cuba, pushed Castro into the open arms of the Soviet Union, and would be seen as one of the most embarrassing political operations of the 20th century. Time, 1963. Place, Washington, D.C. Even after Allen's dismissal from the CIA in 1961 and John Foster's end of tenure of the Secretary of State in 1957, the brothers still managed to keep a handle on major world events into the mid-1960s. Being appointed as member of the Warren Commission, the government investigation group that would look into the causes and possible conspirators involved in the assassination of Allen Dulles and professional rival John F. Kennedy Jr. Creating a whirlwind of controversy, even then, this strange placement of a man who was notoriously fired by the deceased executive into the commission that would investigate his murder was deeply troubling to many across the country. It's worth pointing out that as head of the CIA, Dulles had helped engineer the fall of executives in countries like Guatemala and Iran. Although the Warren Report would eventually point all fingers at the lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, some still find it odd that these brothers, specifically Allen, could have so much effect on the country that never elected them to any office, ever. If operations against the democratic wishes of other nation-states sometimes took years, even decades, to come to light, how long would operations against the democratic wishes of the American people take to do the same? Okay. David Stransberry is an intern contributor. Okay, so we got the basis of that. This article is from Unbranded News. Let's move along. Okay. The Alliance for Human Research and Protection. Okay, the pivotal role of Allen Dulles in shielding Nazi war criminals. Allen Dulles was the longest-serving CIA director who dominated American intelligence. For a generation, he personified a cadre of Ivy League pragmatic elitist in high echelons of the government, who greatly admired Germany's scientific achievements. Princeton educated, Dulles affected the demeanor of a diplomat and professor rather than a spy. Prior to his CIA position, he headed the operations of Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, in Switzerland in the 1930s. Dulles served as legal advisor to the delegations on arms, limitation at the League of Nations, where he met with the world's leaders, including Hitler, Mussolini, Litvinov. He was a senior partner of the law firm Sullivan and Cromwell. Dulles and the other high-ranking intelligence officials and in the State Department had the highest regard for the Nazi elite, the Reichsgenerals, chemists, medical doctors, and engineers, whose research and achievements were mostly in wartime technology, racial hygiene, torture, and genocide. Dulles exploited his post in the OSS to quash war crimes and prosecutions of senior Nazi officials and German business leaders who cooperated with him in a series of clandestine schemes to secure a U.S. advantage in Central Europe. Dulles personally intervened to ensure the escape from prosecution of major German bankers and industrialists, complicit in the Nazis' extermination through slave labor program. Throughout the war and the years after, his reports to Washington ignored almost entirely the massacre of Jews, as though they were of no consequence. A revealing vignette told by Eric Lichtblau. Nazis were given safe haven in the U.S., 2010. The article itself is about how Alan Dulles, who dominated American intelligence for a generation, saved the highest-ranking SS officer who survived the war, General Karl Wolff, Heinrich Himmler's chief of staff, from prosecution, and almost certain execution at Nuremberg. Wolff was a principal sponsor of the on trial at Treblinka. Wait, let me backtrack here. At Nuremberg, Wolff was a principal sponsor of the on trial at the Treblinka extermination camp. Simpson, Splendid Blonde Beast, 1995. He was Himmler's principal liaison officer, one of the most sensitive posts within the Nazi regime, at the interface between Himmler and Hitler. Between 1942 through 1943, Wolff played an active and knowing role in the administrative approval and organization of fatal, diabolical medical experiments, including the high-altitude, low-pressure, and freezing experiments performed on inmates at Dachau concentration and death camp. Wolff personally attended one of the Dachau experiments. It is certain that Wolff's administrative involvement in the medical experiments involving concentration camp inmates represented a crime against humanity under the Nuremberg Charter. Salter and OST, War Crimes and Legal Immunities, Rutgers J. of Law and Religion. Now, at some point, we will be having a discussion about the Holocaust and the possible logistics surrounding that. But that is a very touchy subject, and I know right off the bat we will get banned off YouTube for even questioning certain elements regarding that. Okay, even as the war still raged in defiance of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's orders, Dulles took the time for a friendly fireside chat with Wolff in Zurich. Dulles was greatly impressed with Wolff, with whom he struck a secret deal in violation of an agreement among the Allies. Wolff surrendered the German forces in Italy days before the war's end, enabling American forces to take Trieste. Dulles provided Wolff with U.S. protection by removing his name from the list of defendants at Nuremberg, thereby saving his life. Alan Dulles' betrayal had a wide range of implications, sowing seeds of distrust and the Cold War, and established a pattern of selective obstruction of justice. Kirsten von Lingen, Alan Dulles, the OSS, and Nazi war criminals. So, for people who don't know, I mean, the OSS and Sullivan and Cromwell were basically the precursor to the CIA. While Wolff was in Allied custody, he was permitted to wear his uniform, carry a gun, take a yacht trip, and spend time with his family. Nevertheless, he complained that what he endured was much more inhumane than the extermination of the Jews. He said the Jews had been gassed in a few seconds, while he did not know how long he would be held when his monstrous crimes came to light. Germans gave Wolff the epithet Vernichtung Bürokrat, bureaucrat of death. In 1964, a German judge sentenced Wolff to 15 years in prison for various crimes, including the deportation of 300,000 Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka death camp. He was released in 1968, pleading poor health, but lived until 1984. Dulles had the highest regard for Germany's Nazi elite, the Reich's industrialists, generals, chemists, and medical doctors and engineers whose research and achievements were mostly in wartime technology, racial hygiene, torture, and genocide. Like the Nazis with whom he had cordial relationships, he had fanatic contempt for Soviet communism and harbored decidedly anti-Semitic eugenic views. Under the brothers Dulles' leadership, deadly lawless operations were executed with complete disregard for moral and legal prescriptions, to say nothing about the innocent human casualties that were a consequence of these operations. Now, my input into all of this. I will argue that World War II, in essence, is not as black and white as people would like to make it. I have a very conspiratorial, and of course this podcast is going to be, the whole basis of it is going to be heavy on the conspiratorial side of things. The Bank of International Settlements, we're going to have to get into that. We're going to have to get into the Rothschild dynasty, the founding of the Federal Reserve banking system, elements of what occurred after the Civil War, The Creature of Jekyll Island, written by G. Edward Griffin. This is going to be a mountain of information to cover, and that ties in with the work of Professor Anthony Sutton, his book National Suicide. We'll be discussing even the practical use and methodologies of subversion, Yuri Bezmenov, Anatoly Golitsyn. Okay, it's not as black and white as people would like to think. The Cold War itself was a show. It was an absolute stage play. And that might not be easy for many people to handle, but Alright, so to finish this off, for this episode at least, I'm going to discuss Bertrand Russell from an article from Truth Talk News. Bertrand Russell, Eugenics, Socialism, and the New World Order. Truth Talk News, February the 19th, 2020. And here is a quote from Bertrand Russell's book, The Impact of Science on Society. It is possible that mankind is on the threshold of a golden age, but if so, it will be necessary first to slay the dragon that guards the door, and this dragon is religion. The whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves, but wise people are so full of doubt. The trouble with the world is that the stupid are cocksure and the intelligent are full of doubt. Bertrand Russell. Wikipedia calls Bertrand Russell a British philosopher, logician, mathematician, historian, socialist, pacifist, and social critic. Like fellow eugenicist Margaret Sanger, their reputations are praised in history books, classrooms, mass media, and public and political rhetoric. Russell was an old money elitist. He was also a Fabian socialist, eugenicist, and social engineer, in true New World Order fashion. Bertrand Russell claimed to be a meek, compassionate pacifist, but in reality, he was an old money Fabian socialist, racist, Malthusian, eugenicist, and social engineer. Russell descended from an old establishment family. He was a propagandist whose job it was to propagate certain ideas in the service of the moneyed elites. He was instrumental in the project to wreck European and American culture through his chairmanship of the CIA-sponsored Congress for Cultural Freedom. Claiming to be a pacifist, Bertrand Russell was a racist Fabian socialist and promoter of depopulation. He promoted the well-known policy of mutually assured destruction and founded the Pugwash movement, which used fear and the specter of the Cold War nuclear annihilation to push for world government. Alongside H.G. Wells, Margaret Sanger, George Bernard Shaw, and others, Bertrand Russell were Malthusian ideologues and one world government promoters. Bertrand Russell was a significant figure in the agenda to bring about the post-World War II New World Order agenda. Social engineering changes that for 50 years were being dragged by the elite Fabian socialist turtle shielded the wolves in sheep's clothing that adorns their logo. The logo was created by a Fabian socialist elitist, George Bernard Shaw. Considering the current increasing violence and threat to Christians and Jews, for greater understanding of the dangerous principle, America and the world stand before the following quote. Bertrand Russell should be illuminating quotes from his works. His works reveal a conflict of duality in thought, both benevolent and despotic. In 1952, Russell's revealing and prophetic masterwork, The Impact of Science on Society, was published. The book begins with a very kind, sympathetic, and humanitarian tilt to draw the readers in. But as the pages unfold, the dark underbelly of Russell's ideological beliefs fester to the surface as evil totalitarian rot. Der Dunkel Unterbausch von Russells ideologischen Überzugungen eitert an der Oberfläche Ausbos. Oh God. No, sorry, you have to pardon me for this little German segment. Okay, on pages 40 through 41, he wrote, I think the subject which will be of most importance politically is mass psychology, propaganda. Of these, the most influential is what is called education. Religion plays a part, though a diminishing one. The press, the cinema, and the radio play an increasing part. And now, of course, we have the internet. It may be hoped that in time anybody will be able to persuade anybody of anything if he can catch the patient young and is provided by the state with money and equipment. The subject will make great strides when it is taken up by scientists under a scientific dictatorship. The social psychologist of the future will have a number of classes of school children on whom they will try different methods of producing an unshakable conviction that snow is black. Various results will soon be arrived at. First, that the influence of home is obstructive. Second, that not much can be done unless indoctrination begins before the age of 10. Third, that verses set to music and repeatedly intoned are very effective. Fourth, that the opinion that snow is white must be held to show a morbid taste for eccentricity. But I anticipate it is for future scientists to make these maxims precise and discover exactly how much it cost per head to make children believe that snow is black, and how much less it would cost to make them believe it is dark gray. Although this science will be diligently studied, it will be rigidly confined to the governing class. The populace will not be allowed to know how its convictions were generated when the technique has been perfected. Every government that has been in charge of education for a generation will be able to control its subjects securely without the need of armies or policemen. On pages 49 through 50, Russell wrote the following alarming and prophetic prediction. Scientific societies are as yet in their infancy. It is to be expected that advances in physiology and psychology will give governments much more control over the individual mentality than they now have even in totalitarian countries. Fitch laid it down. Education should aim at destroying free will, so that after pupils have left school, they shall be incapable throughout the rest of their lives of thinking or acting otherwise than as their schoolmasters would have wished. Diet, injections, and injunctions will combine from a very early age to produce the sort of character and sort of beliefs that the authorities consider desirable. And any serious criticism of the powers that be will become psychologically impossible. The Nazis were more scientific than the present rulers of Russia. If they had survived, they would probably have soon taken to scientific breeding. Any nation which adopts this practice will, within a generation, secure great military advantages. The system, one may surmise, will be something like this, except possibility in the governing aristocracy. After all but 5% of males and 30% of females will be sterilized. The 30% of females will be expected to spend their years from 18 to 40 in reproduction in order to secure adequate cannon fodder. As a rule, artificial insemination will be preferred to the natural method. Gradually, by selective breeding, the congenital differences between rulers and ruled will increase until they become almost a different species. A revolt of the plebs would become unthinkable. An organized insurrection of sheep against the practice of eating mutton. On page 54, Russell continued, "After all, most civilized and semi-civilized countries known to history and had a large class of slaves and serfs completely subordinate to their owners. There is nothing in human nature that makes the persistence of such a system impossible, and the whole development of scientific technique has made it easier than when the government controls the distribution of food. Its power is absolute, so long as they can count on the police and armed forces, and their loyalty can be secured by giving them some privileges of the governing class. I do not see how any internal movement of revolt can ever bring freedom to the oppressed in a modern scientific dictatorship. Regarding the ongoing 1957 depopulation agenda, on pages 103 and 104, Russell wrote, "I do not pretend that birth control is the only way in which population can be kept from increasing. There are others, which one must suppose opponents of birth control would prefer. War, as I remarked a moment ago, has hitherto been disappointing in this respect, but perhaps bacteriological war may prove more effective. The Black Death could be spread throughout the world once in every generation. Survivors could procreate freely without making the world too full. There would be nothing in this to offend consciences of the devout or to restrain the ambitions of nationalists. The state affairs might be somewhat unpleasant, but what of that? Really high-minded people are indifferent to happiness, especially other people's. However, I am wandering from the question of stability, to which I must return. There are 3 ways of securing a society that shall be stable as regards population. The first is that birth control. The second is that infanticide are really destructive wars. And the third, that of general misery except for a powerful minority. All these methods have been practiced. The first, for example, by the Australian Aborigines, the second by the Aztecs and the Spartans, and the rulers of Plato's Republic. The third in the world, as some Western internationalists hope to make it, and in Soviet Russia. Of these 3, only birth control avoids extreme cruelty and unhappiness for the majority of human beings. Meanwhile, so long as there is not a single world government, there will be competition for power among the different nations. As increase of population brings the threat of famine, national power will become more and more obviously the only way of avoiding starvation. There will therefore be blocks in which the hungry nations band together against those that are well fed. That is the explanation of the victory of communism in China. Okay, step 4. On page 105, Russell continued, the need for a world government, if the population problem is to be solved in any humane manner, is completely evident on Darwinian principles. Total NWO bullshit philosophy, that's what it boils down to. That's not actually part of the quote, that's just, part of the article I'm reading. A society is not stable unless it is on the whole satisfactory to the holders of power, and the holders of power are not exposed to the risk of successful revolution. On pages 110 to 111, Bertrand Russell wrote, first, as regards physical conditions, soil and raw materials must not be used up so fast that scientific progress cannot continually make good the loss by means of new inventions and discoveries. If raw materials are not to be used up too fast, there must not be free competition for their acquisition and use, but an international authority to ration them, such quantities as may, from time to time, seem compatible with continued industrial prosperity, and similar considerations apply to soil conservation. Second, as regards to population. To deal with this problem will be necessary to find ways of preventing an increase in world population. If this is to be done otherwise, then by wars, pestilence, and famines, it will demand a powerful internal authority. This authority should deal out the world's food to the various nations in proportion to their population at the time of the establishment of the authority. If any nation subsequently increased its population, it should not, on that account, receive any more food. The motive for not increasing population would therefore be very compelling. During the period immediately after World War II, the campaign to create a Cold War was fomented. The propaganda phrase Cold War was first coined by CFR, Council on Foreign Relations, mouthpiece, the infamous Walter Lippmann. The CIA was then organized under the National Security Act of 1947. Very important year. The United Nations was founded soon after by Soviet spy Alger Hiss. Covert operations to subvert the minds of America's future children were revealed in the Reese Committee hearings of 1953 into the great tax-exempt foundations. It was discovered that via educational grant giving, the Ford, Carnegie, and Rockefeller foundations promoted communism, now called globalism, to comfortably merge the United States with the Soviet Union. What they call it has changed several times, but this communist agenda continues till this day. I apologize for sort of my struggle to read through this article. It's written in very fine print, and my eyes are starting to hurt. I've dug into so much material. But this concludes this episode. Thank you for wading through, for those of you who have stuck in through the long haul. The second episode will be coming soon.